Now I'm going to ask you a question, and while you're answering it, I want you to imagine yourself on the deck of an old destroyer gliding through the dark waters of the Atlantic on a cold March night in 1942. It makes you shiver just thinking about it, doesn't it? Your nostrils fill with both sea salt and that sharp smell of something burning. In the darkness, you hear only the sound of waves, and you know this: in the bow of the ship, hidden beneath steel and concrete, there are 4.5 tons of explosives. In 8 hours, this ship will blow up, and you're still on board. So why? Why did a group of young men volunteer for a mission from which return was nearly impossible? Why did they write farewell letters to their families, put on clean underwear, and sail toward death? If you're curious about the answers to these questions, you're in the right place, because today I'm going to tell you one of the craziest, most heroic, and perhaps least known stories of World War II. This story begins with a ship called HMS Campbeltown crashing into the gates of the massive dry dock at St. Nazaire Harbor. But the real story is about the men who stayed on that ship. If you watch this video to the end, you'll see behind the scenes of one of the bravest operations in military history. And I promise you, this story will both amaze you and deeply move you. If you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now because there are plenty of videos like this here, and new ones come every day. If you're ready, let's begin. In early 1942, things were not looking good for Britain. Singapore had fallen to the Japanese. German U-boats were roaming the Atlantic, sinking nearly 2 ships a day. Winston Churchill would later confess that the only thing that really frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. But there was another nightmare haunting the British: Tirpitz. Tirpitz was the sister ship of Bismarck, a 50,000-ton monster. With its thick armor and massive guns, if it entered the Atlantic, no British warship could stand against it alone. And if this giant ship were damaged, there was only one place it could go for repairs: the port of Saint-Nazaire on the west coast of France. The Normandy dry dock at Saint-Nazaire was built in 1932 for the SS Normandy ocean liner. It was the largest dry dock on Europe's Atlantic coast and the only facility capable of accommodating Tirpitz. British naval intelligence used simple logic: if we destroy this dock, Tirpitz won't dare venture into the Atlantic, because even damaged, it would have nowhere to return for repairs. This was a very logical plan. But how? Air bombardment wasn't working. The RAF had tried multiple times and failed. A naval attack meant suicide because the mouth of the Loire River was full of mines and coastal batteries. Carrying enough explosives for sabotage? Impossible. This is exactly when a crazy idea was born at Lord Louis Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters: ramming an explosive-laden ship into the dock gates. It sounded insane, but sometimes the ideas that change history start exactly like this. The operation was codenamed Chariot. The plan was as follows: an old destroyer would be filled with explosives, secretly infiltrated into Saint-Nazaire, and rammed into the steel gates of the dry dock. Once the ship lodged into the gates, delayed explosives inside would detonate and render the dock unusable. Meanwhile, Commandos would disembark from the ship and sabotage critical facilities in the harbor. An old destroyer borrowed from the Americans was chosen for the mission: USS Buchanan. After being transferred to Britain, it was renamed HMS Campbeltown. This ship had been built in Maine in 1918. By 1942, it was already old and obsolete, but it was perfect for this mission because losing it wouldn't be a strategic loss. Campbeltown's transformation began at Devonport Dockyard. The ship would be made unrecognizable. 2 of its 4 funnels were cut down. The tops of the remaining 2 were cut at angles to resemble German Moa-class torpedo boats. 3 4-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and depth charges were removed. In their place, 8 Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft guns and heavy machine guns on the bridge wings were installed. But the real work was done where no one could see. A special compartment was built in the bow of the ship just behind the fuel tank. This compartment was lined with steel and concrete. Inside, 24 depth charges were placed. Total weight, 4.5 tons of explosives. The person responsible for designing this massive bomb was a 28-year-old naval officer, Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz. Tirpitz was an explosives expert from HMS Vernon Torpedo and Mining School in Portsmouth. He was perfect for this mission. His plan was as follows. The depth charges would be linked together and buried inside the concrete and steel casing. The fuses would work on a system called pencil timers set to detonate with an 8 to 10 hour delay. Why such a long delay? Because after the ship hit the gates, the crew and commandos needed to be evacuated. An immediate explosion would mean killing their own men. But if it was too late, the Germans might find the bomb. Tirpitz calculated everything down to the finest detail. The bow of the ship would be crushed on impact, but the compartment containing the explosives would be far enough back to remain undamaged. This calculation was of vital importance because if the explosives were damaged during the collision, the entire plan would fail. King George V Dry Dock in Southampton was built on the same plan as the dock at St. Nazaire. The commandos trained here for weeks. They learned to plant explosives on pump stations in the dark, blindfolded. The goal was for each team to complete their mission in under 10 minutes. The ground forces commander for the operation would be Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman of the Essex Regiment. Newman was 38 years old and normally worked as a building contractor, but his leadership ability and the bond he formed with his men would make him a legendary commander. Commander Robert Ryder was in charge of the naval forces. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty would captain Campbeltown. These three men formed the three pillars of the operation, and all three would receive the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor. What do you think will happen in this operation? March 26, 1942, 2 p.m. The flotilla departed from Falmouth Harbor. Campbeltown in front, followed by 16 motor launches, a torpedo boat, and a gunboat. A total of 622 men, 346 Royal Navy personnel, and 265 commandos. The men didn't know their destination for the first leg of the journey. When they learned the next day and looked at the map, St. Nazaire was 600 kilometers from the nearest British port, on the west coast of France, at the mouth of the Loire River, right in the heart of enemy territory. Their chances of returning were very slim. Everyone knew this, but no one backed down. During the voyage, the men sang songs, ate ham and raisins. Morale was high. But in the back of everyone's mind was the same question: how many of us will be alive this time tomorrow? That was the cruelty of war, unfortunately. On the morning of March 27th, the flotilla encountered a German submarine in the open sea. U-593 was on the surface, but didn't notice the British. They continued on their way without engaging the submarine. Luck was on the British side, for now. In the evening hours, the sky filled with the sound of bombs. The RAF was conducting a diversionary bombardment. 65 bombers were flying over St. Nazaire, but due to cloudy weather, the attack was ineffective. Worse, it aroused German suspicions. Captain Karl Conrad Mecke, commander of the 22nd Naval Flak Brigade at St. Nazaire, sensed something was wrong. The bombers weren't behaving normally. They were dropping bombs one at a time, not full loads. Mecke ordered his men to stay alert. After midnight, the flotilla entered the mouth of the Loire River. Now they would advance for 6 kilometers through shallow waters, sandbanks, and past enemy batteries on both shores. Campbeltown scraped the sand twice but continued forward. To deceive the Germans, German war ensigns had been raised on the ships. With her darkened silhouette, Campbeltown resembled a German torpedo boat. This trick bought them a few precious minutes. At 1:22 a.m., German searchlights suddenly switched on. The flotilla was illuminated. Campbeltown responded to the German signal lamp challenge with German codes. "We request urgent harbor access with damaged ships," they signaled. This response bought them a few more minutes. But the Germans figured out the trap, and the gates of hell opened. Coastal batteries opened fire. Searchlights turned night into day. Campbeltown was hit repeatedly. The helmsman was killed. The second helmsman who took over was also shot. Tirpitz, the explosives expert, calmly took the wheel. Beatty was looking out through the gap in the bridge, trying to find the target despite the blinding lights. Campbeltown increased speed, 19 knots. She tore through the torpedo net, and at 1:34 a.m. she reached her target. The ship crashed into the massive steel gates of the dry dock. The force of the impact crushed 11 meters of her bow. The ship was lodged right in the center of the gates, her bow suspended in the air. Beatty calmly murmured, "Well, here we are, 4 minutes late." Campbeltown had done her job. Now it was the Commandos' turn, and the clock on the explosives had started counting down. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to watch the continuation of this video, because in the second part, I'll tell you about the heroic stories of the Commandos who disembarked on shore and the incredible explosion that happened that morning. That's all for now, but the story has just begun. Are you curious? Then let's move on to Part 2. Welcome to Part 2. We're continuing without pause. In Part 1, I told you how HMS Campbeltown, loaded with 4.5 tons of explosives, rammed into the massive dry dock gates of Nazaire. The ship had done its job, but the operation was just beginning. Because now it was time for the Commandos who disembarked from the ship to do their work. And their story is perhaps even more impressive than the ship itself. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. This helps the channel grow and allows me to produce more content. Now let's continue. The moment Campbeltown hit the gates, the Commandos on deck sprang into action. Most had already been wounded during the journey up the Loire River. German bullets had struck every part of the ship, but wounded or not, every man knew his mission. Among the first to disembark were the assault teams of Captain Donald Roy and Lieutenant John Roderick. Roy, wearing a Scottish kilt, was an officer whose men addressed him as Laird. His mission was to neutralize the German gun positions on the roof of the pump house and capture a bridge so the Commandos could reach the evacuation point. Roy and Sergeant Don Randall climbed the stairs and reached the roof. They cleared the German positions with grenades. Then they ran to the bridge. German machine guns were raking the bridge, but Roy didn't stop. He gathered his men and plunged straight into the fire. They captured the bridge and established a bridgehead. This bridge was vital because it was the withdrawal route for the sabotage teams. Following Roy was Lieutenant Stuart Chant's sabotage team. Chant had been wounded in his right arm and left leg during the river journey, but he didn't stop because his mission was perhaps the most critical target of the operation, destroying the pump house. The pump house drained water from inside the dry dock. Without these massive machines, the dock couldn't function. Chant's team would blow these pumps sky high. Chant and his men reached the steel doors of the pump house. The doors were locked. They attached a small magnetic explosive called a clam to the door and blasted their way in. Now they had to descend a dark staircase 40 feet down to the underground engine room. One of Chant's men was wounded and couldn't walk. They left him at the door as a sentry. Sergeant Arthur Dockerell, a man who had previously sung in the choir at Ely Cathedral, took both his own 60-pound explosive bag and his wounded comrade's bag on his back. He descended the dark stairs carrying 120 pounds of explosives. Below, the massive pump motors awaited them. They had to work in darkness because the electricity was cut. But this didn't stop them. During training in Southampton, they had learned to do this job blindfolded. Darkness was a familiar friend to them. Chant placed 40 pounds of plastic explosive on each pump. His hands were wounded and he was losing blood, but his hands didn't tremble as he attached the 90-second fuses. When he finished, he sent his men up. Only Dockerell stayed with him. "If I can't light the fuses because of my wounds, you'll do it," Chant said. But that wasn't necessary. They lit the fuses and started running. Subscribe for this story. Just as they reached the top of the stairs, a massive explosion erupted behind them. The pump house turned into a pile of rubble. The enormous motors tumbled to the bottom of the crater. Chant and his team had completed their mission, but hell awaited them outside. At the same time, another team under Major Bill Copland was attacking the engine room housing the operating mechanism of the North Gate. Lieutenant Corin Purdon broke through the steel door with a sledgehammer. They placed the explosives and blew the engine room sky high. The southern engine room was also destroyed by Lieutenant Christopher Smalley's team. Smalley completed his mission but was killed by German fire while withdrawing. Lieutenant Gerard Brett's team placed backup explosives on the southern gate of the dry dock. If the main bomb in Campbeltown failed to detonate, these explosives would destroy the gate, double security just in case. Lieutenant Christopher Burtonshaw and his team attacked the winding house directly above the north gate of the dry dock. Burtonshaw was humming a march as he advanced. He appeared as calm as if he were going on a picnic. His team carried only pistols because they had heavy explosive bags on their backs, yet they attacked against German automatic weapons. The Germans fled, but Burtonshaw was shot and killed at the edge of the quay. The march froze on his lips. The Commandos from Campbeltown were completing their missions at incredible speed. Within half an hour, the critical infrastructure of the dry dock had been destroyed. Pump houses, engine rooms, gate mechanisms, all reduced to rubble. But the other Commandos arriving by motor launch weren't so lucky. Most of the 16 motor launches were torn apart under German fire on the Loire River. These vessels had wooden hulls and carried extra fuel drums on their decks. When a bullet struck, they turned into fireballs. Motor Launch 262 couldn't reach the right spot because the skipper had been blinded by searchlights. Motor Launch 298 exploded, killing nearly everyone aboard. Motor Launch 177 managed to reach the old entrance, but this was the exception. Only 2 of the 12 launches managed to land their commandos. And right in the middle of this chaos, one of the most extraordinary heroism stories in military history unfolded. Motor Launch 306 came under heavy fire while advancing up the Loire River. At the stern of the launch, just behind the bridge, there was a Lewis machine gun position with no protection whatsoever. At this position was Sergeant Thomas Durrant. Durrant was a 23-year-old Royal Engineers soldier attached to No. 1 Commando, and that night he displayed one of the most incredible acts of resistance of the war. While the launch was taking fire from coastal batteries, Durrant continued firing his machine gun with no protection. He was hit in the arm. He didn't let go of his weapon. As the launch tried to withdraw downstream, it encountered a German torpedo boat in the darkness, Jaguar, a massive ship, and it had spotted Motor Launch 306. Jaguar's searchlights illuminated the small launch. It opened fire from 50 to 60 yards, sometimes even closer. This was David versus Goliath, a small wooden-hulled boat against an armored torpedo vessel. And Durrant continued raking Jaguar's bridge with his Lewis gun. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and like right now. Thank you. Jaguar's commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Paul, demanded their surrender. Durrant's answer was more gunfire. Durrant was hit repeatedly, in the head, in both arms, in the legs, in the chest, in the abdomen. 27 bullet wounds would be counted on his body, but he kept standing. His only support was the machine gun he was leaning against. Finally, the only unwounded officer on his launch, Lieutenant Ronnie Swain, shouted from the wreckage, "I'm afraid we can't go on." The battle was over. It had lasted nearly an hour. Durrant was still at his gun, but he was so badly wounded that his comrades couldn't lift him. "Leave me," he said. The Germans took him aboard their ship, but due to his wounds, he died shortly afterward in a German military hospital. And now I come to the most extraordinary part of this story. Jaguar's commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Paul, visited captured British officer Lieutenant Colonel Newman at the prisoner of war camp, and he said this to him: "There was a man on your launch, the machine gunner. You should recommend him for a high decoration." A German officer had recommended a medal for an enemy soldier. This was an almost unprecedented event in British military history. The Victoria Cross was normally awarded on the recommendation of one's own commanders, but Durrant's Victoria Cross was recommended by the enemy who had tried to kill him, because some acts of heroism transcend which side of the war you're on. Thomas Durrant's Victoria Cross is displayed today at the Royal Engineers Museum in England, and behind that medal is a story that even a German officer bowed to in respect. What great heroism, isn't it? Now let's return to the shore. Around 2:30 a.m., the Commandos gathered at the Old Mole evacuation point faced a terrible reality. Most of the motor launches had sunk or were burning. There was no ship to take them home. Lieutenant Colonel Newman gathered his surviving men. More than half were wounded. Ammunition was running low, and they were surrounded by thousands of German soldiers. Newman gave 3 orders. First, engage the enemy wherever possible. Second, destroy everything you can. Third, if possible, do not surrender. Then he added, "Well, gentlemen, we've missed the boat. We'll have to walk home." Walk home. 600 kilometers from Saint-Nazaire to the Spanish border, through the middle of enemy territory, wounded, exhausted, out of ammunition. It seemed insane, but Newman had left no other choice. At 3 a.m., the Commandos moved toward the town, but ahead of them was a narrow iron bridge, and German machine guns were raking this bridge. Newman assessed the situation. Major Copeland came to his side. Newman asked, "Shall we call it a day?" Copeland's team at that point consisted entirely of wounded men, but his answer was unhesitating. "Certainly not, Colonel. We'll fight our way out." Newman looked at the bridge. Then he turned to his men. "Come on, lads, let's go." And together they charged the bridge under machine gun fire. This moment went down in history as one of the most iconic images of the Saint-Nazaire raid. A group of wounded, exhausted commandos with dwindling ammunition was running toward death, but they kept running. They crossed the bridge. Street fighting began in the narrow streets of the town. Commandos were jumping from roof to roof, scaling garden walls, passing through chicken coops. This chaotic escape would later be called the Saint-Nazaire obstacle race. but the Germans were too numerous. There were 6,000 German soldiers in the area, and all of them were on alert. As dawn broke, the surviving commandos had scattered around St. Nazaire. Small groups were hiding in bombed buildings, basements, and back alleys. Most were wounded. Ammunition was gone. Their only hope was to wait for nightfall and escape into the countryside. Newman was in a basement with the largest group, about 15 commandos, most wounded. They waited in silence. Then a German grenade rolled down the stairs. Everyone held their breath. The grenade didn't explode. But the game was over. German soldiers were outside, and the next grenade might detonate. Newman, with a bitter decision, climbed the stairs and announced their surrender. But not everyone surrendered. 5 commandos managed to escape from St. Nazaire. Corporal Wheeler, Lance Corporal Douglas, Lance Corporal Howarth, Lance Corporal Sims, and Private Harding. These 5 men broke through the German cordon and reached the countryside. With help from French farming families and the resistance movement, they made their way south, a 600-kilometer journey through enemy territory. Eventually, they reached Spain. From there, they crossed to Gibraltar, and they returned to England by ship. 5 men, 600 kilometers, enemy territory, and they made it home. What an insane achievement. Now let's return to that morning, March 28, 1942. The fighting had died down. The Germans had the town under control. Captured British soldiers were being interrogated, and everyone had the same question on their mind. Why hasn't Campbeltown exploded yet? The explosives were supposed to detonate at 4:30 a.m., but that hour came and went. Nothing happened. The Germans relaxed. Hundreds of soldiers and curious civilians crowded onto the ship. Some were looking for souvenirs. About 40 senior German officers and civilian officials had come to inspect the vessel. The captured British soldiers waited. As hours passed, despair grew. Was something wrong with the explosives? Had all that planning, all those losses been for nothing? Lieutenant Commander Beatty was being interrogated by a German intelligence officer. The German officer, in a mocking tone, said that ramming a ship into the gates wouldn't cause any permanent damage. And at that exact moment, at 10:35 a.m., the world shook. Campbeltown exploded. 4.5 tons of explosives detonated in a massive blast. The front half of the ship was blown to pieces. The steel gates of the dry dock were torn from their hinges. Atlantic waters flooded into the dock. Approximately 360 Germans on and around the ship at the moment of the explosion were killed. Among them were the 40 senior German officers and civilian officials who had come to inspect the vessel. When the captured British soldiers heard the explosion in their interrogation rooms, they smiled. Even the wounded joined in this smile. Tirpitz fuses had worked. Delayed, but they had done their job. The German officer in the interrogation room stared at Beatty in shock. Beatty responded with an expressionless face. Sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words. But the chaos wasn't over. Subscribe and like for this story. On the evening of March 30, 2 days later, 2 more explosions rocked the town. Motor Torpedo Boat 74 had fired delayed torpedoes at the gates of the old entrance during the attack, and now these torpedoes had detonated. The Germans panicked. They thought a second attack had begun. They shot everyone who came into the street, French workers, civilians. 16 French civilians were killed, more than 30 wounded. Organization Taut workers were mown down, mistaken for British commandos because of their khaki uniforms. German soldiers fired on each other. They fought ghost enemies in the darkness. A total of 300 to 400 Germans and Organization Taut workers lost their lives in this chaos. The Normandy dry dock remained unusable for the rest of the war. Full repairs weren't completed until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. Tirpitz never ventured into the Atlantic. It was sunk by the RAF in Norwegian fjords in 1944. The St. Nazaire raid had made it impossible for this giant to risk entering the Atlantic. Of 612 men, 169 were killed. 215 were captured. Only 228 returned to England. But despite the losses they suffered, they had completed their mission. Operation Chariot went down in military history as the greatest raid of all. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, a record number for a single operation. A total of 89 decorations were distributed. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, Lieutenant Commander Beatty, and Commander Ryder received the Victoria Cross. Sergeant Thomas Durrant and able seaman William Savage were awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. At the prisoner of war camp, the German camp commandant held a special ceremony. He read Beatty's Victoria Cross citation in front of all the prisoners. A German honor guard saluted. Even enemies recognized heroism. In the third and final part of this video, I'll tell you about the unsung heroes behind this operation, its long-term effects, and what this raid means for us today. If you were moved by this story, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel because there are more details waiting for you in the final part. If you're curious about the final part, let's move right on. Welcome back, everyone, to the final part. In the first 2 parts, I told you how HMS Campbeltown reached St. Nazaire, how the Commandos fought on shore, and how that massive explosion occurred. Now we're in the final part, and in this part, we'll look at the unsung heroes behind this operation, the stories of the survivors, and what this raid means for us today. But first, let's take a step back and look at the big picture. Because the St. Nazaire raid wasn't just a military operation. Every man who was there that night became a link in a chain that changed the course of history. Let's begin. On the morning of March 28, 1942, St. Nazaire Harbor had turned into a battlefield. The wreckage of burning motor launches drifted in the Loire River, British and German bodies lay side by side on the quays, and Campbeltown, lodged in the dry dock gates, stood like a Trojan horse waiting in silence. The Germans thought they had won a victory that morning. Most of the British were dead or captured. The ship had hit the gates, but appeared to have caused no serious damage. Perhaps with a few weeks of repairs, everything would return to normal. They would realize how wrong they were a few hours later. When Campbeltown exploded at 10:35 a.m., the fate of the Normandy dry dock was sealed. The gates were blown to pieces, seawater flooded into the dock, and that massive facility became unusable for the rest of the war. But that's only the military dimension of this story. The real story is about the men who participated in that operation. Do you remember Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz? The man who designed the explosive system in Campbeltown and set the fuses, the architect of the explosion. Before the operation, Tirpitz had written a letter to his young wife, Elmsley. In his letter, he said he might not return. He asked her to prepare herself for this. He was 28 years old, a brilliant engineer from the Royal Navy Torpedo and Mining School at Portsmouth, and the system he designed worked perfectly. 4.5 tons of explosives detonated exactly as planned. But Tirpitz never saw it. After Campbeltown hit the gates, Tirpitz and Captain Beatty were evacuated aboard Motor Launch 177. As the launch tried to exit the Loire River, it came under fire from coastal batteries. A shell hit the engine room. A fire broke out. Tirpitz was on deck, talking to Campbeltown's navigation officer when he was hit by machine gun fire from the shore. He died right there. The letter he wrote to his wife reached her a few weeks later. Tirpitz's letter saying he would probably not return became a prophecy. But the bomb he designed changed history. The Normandy dry dock couldn't be repaired until 1948. Tirpitz never dared risk entering the Atlantic. Thousands of Allied sailors' lives may have been saved. One man's genius and sacrifice. Now I want to tell you about another name, Sergeant Arthur Dockerell. Dockerell was in Lieutenant Chant's sabotage team, the team that blew up the pump house, a quiet man who had previously sung in the choir at Ely Cathedral. When one of Chant's team members was wounded, Dockerell took both his own 60-pound explosive bag and his wounded comrade's bag on his back, 120 pounds. He descended the dark stairs, he placed the explosives on the pumps, and then he stayed with Chant. "If I can't light the fuses because of my wounds, you'll do it," Chant had said. Dockerell nodded and waited. The fuses were lit. They ran together. Behind them, the pump house exploded. Dockerell survived. He made it through the war. But that night, the man who descended the stairs in a dark basement with 120 pounds of explosives remained one of history's unsung heroes. His name doesn't appear in books. He's not played in films, but he was there, and he did his duty. I also need to tell you about Lieutenant Tom Boyd on Motor Launch 306. Boyd was one of the officers who witnessed Sergeant Thomas Durrant's legendary last stand. While Durrant was waging that impossible duel with Jaguar, Boyd was tending to the wounded. After the launch surrendered, Boyd and the survivors were captured by the Germans. They were taken to a prisoner of war camp, and there Boyd encountered surprising news. Jaguar's commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Powell, had visited the camp. He wanted to meet with Lieutenant Colonel Newman, and he told him Durrant's story. "That man," Powell said, "was a hero. You should recommend him for the highest decoration." A German naval officer was nominating an enemy soldier he had tried to kill just hours earlier for a medal. This showed that even in the madness of war, some values are universal. Newman passed on this recommendation after he was released from the prisoner of war camp, and Thomas Durrant received the Victoria Cross in 1945, 3 years after his death. The medal was presented to Durrant's mother at Buckingham Palace by King George VI. Durrant's brother was also there. An interesting coincidence. Durrant's brother Jack had received the military medal in 1940 for rescuing survivors from the ship Lancastria, which sank near St. Nazaire. Tommy had accompanied his brother to the medal ceremony, and at that ceremony he had said, "Jack, when we get back to St. Nazaire, we'll show them." A year and a half later, he returned to St. Nazaire, and he showed them. Do you remember that 5 commandos managed to escape to Spain? Corporal Wheeler, Lance Corporal Douglas, Lance Corporal Howarth, Lance Corporal Sims, and Private Harding. The story of these 5 men could be an epic in itself. After managing to get out of St. Nazaire, they walked for weeks through the French countryside. They hid during the day, traveled at night. French farming families provided them with food and shelter. The resistance movement directed them to the next safe house. 600 kilometers, enemy territory, checkpoints, patrols, and all 5 passed through without being caught. When they crossed the Spanish border, nearly a month had passed. They reached Gibraltar, and from there they returned to England by ship. Lance Corporal Edward Douglas received the military medal for this escape, but more important than the medal was what those 5 men proved. Human will can prevail even in the most impossible circumstances. Subscribe and like for these heroes. Thank you. Life in the prisoner of war camps was another story altogether. 215 British soldiers had been captured. They were taken first to La Baule, then to Stalag 133 in Rennes. Most were wounded, but morale was high, because Campbeltown had exploded. When the prisoners received news of the explosion, they smiled quietly. Their mission was complete. The losses were heavy, but they hadn't been in vain. An interesting scene occurred at the prisoner of war camp. The German camp commandant arranged a special ceremony. He gathered all the prisoners. A Wehrmacht honor guard lined up. Then the commandant read Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty's Victoria Cross citation aloud, in German, in the enemy's language. But there, at that moment, language didn't matter. The honor guard saluted. The prisoners stood at attention, and everyone, men from both sides of the war, felt the same thing for a moment: respect. Beatty remained a prisoner until the end of the war. When he was released in 1945, he received his Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace. In 1947, France awarded him the Legion of Honor. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman had also been captured. After that surrender in the basement, he spent the rest of the war in camps. Newman continued to be a leader even in the camp. He kept his men's morale high. He made escape plans. He created difficulties for the Germans at every opportunity. When the war ended, he returned to England and received his Victoria Cross. At the ceremony, he spoke of his Commandos' heroism. He downplayed his own role. But everyone knew, without Newman, the operation wouldn't have been this successful. He was the man who prepared his men for that impossible mission, gave them confidence, and could say, "We'll walk home at the darkest moment." Newman died in 1972, but his legacy lives on. Today, British commandos speak his name with respect. Let's not forget to subscribe for this great hero, Newman. So what was the long-term impact of this operation? First, the Tirpitz issue. The most powerful ship in the German Navy couldn't risk entering the Atlantic after the dry dock at St. Nazaire was destroyed. It continued hiding in Norwegian fjords. In 1944, the RAF sank Tirpitz with Operation Catechism. The ship never got to attack Atlantic convoys. What does this mean? Thousands of Allied ships crossed the Atlantic without the Tirpitz threat. Thousands of tons of supplies reached England. Thousands of lives may have been saved. Second, the morale effect. In early 1942, things were going badly for Britain. Singapore had fallen. Rommel was advancing in North Africa. The public was demoralized. The St. Nazaire raid showed that Britain could still fight. Churchill proudly telegraphed Roosevelt Dickey's show at St. Nazaire. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological victory. Third, the development of commando tactics. St. Nazaire proved that large-scale commando operations were possible. The lessons learned were applied all the way to the Normandy landings in 1944. And fourth, Hitler's reaction. The Führer was furious that the British had been able to get a flotilla up the Loire River. He dismissed General Oberst Karl Hilpert, the Chief of Staff of OB West. More importantly, Hitler issued his infamous Commando Order that year. This order commanded that captured commandos be treated not as prisoners of war, but as terrorists and executed. This order was a war crime, and ironically, it was proof of how effective British commandos were. Hitler was so afraid of them that he was willing to violate the laws of war. Now I want to tell you about the least-known heroes of this story, the French people. The residents of Saint-Nazaire suffered greatly that night and afterward. First, there were civilian casualties during the raid. When the Germans opened fire in panic, some French civilians lost their lives. Then, after the delayed torpedo explosions on March 30, the Germans cracked down on the city. They went hunting for resistance fighters. Organization taught workers were shot, mistaken for commandos because of their khaki uniforms. French civilians were randomly arrested. 1,500 French citizens were sent to an internment camp at Savonay. Most had nothing to do with the raid. Their only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many homes in the old town were destroyed. Families became homeless. But the French people continued to help British commandos. It was French farmers and resistance members who hid, fed, and guided the 5 escaping commandos. The names of these people are mostly unknown. If they had been caught, they would have been executed, but they helped anyway. Because some things are stronger than fear. They, too, became the unsung heroes of the war. The Saint-Nazaire Society keeps this legacy alive today. As a registered charity in England, it preserves the memory of those who participated in the raid. There's a memorial at Falmouth Harbor. It reads, Operation Chariot. From this port, 622 sailors and commandos set forth on a successful raid on Saint-Nazaire, 28 March 1942. 168 were killed. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded. At the National Memorial Arboretum in England, there's a tree and a bench. The bench reads, In memory of the Royal Navy sailors and Army commandos who died in the raid on Saint-Nazaire on 28 March 1942. And in Saint-Nazaire, France, there's the Le Boul-Escoublac War Cemetery. British soldiers who died in the raid rest there. Memorial ceremonies are held every year. They were buried in enemy territory by the enemy, but they are remembered as heroes. The story of HMS Campbeltown didn't end either. The original Campbelltown's bell was saved during the raid. At the end of the war, this bell was presented to the town of Campbelltown in Pennsylvania. The ship's name already came from this United States town. In 1987, a new HMS Campbeltown was built, a Type 22 frigate, and the townspeople in Pennsylvania voted to loan the original bell to this new ship. The bell remained on the new Campbelltown until the ship was decommissioned in 2011. Then it returned to the town. 1 bell, 2 ships, 2 countries, and a bond spanning more than 80 years. Now let's think about what this story means for today. The Saint-Nazaire raid shows what it takes to accomplish a seemingly impossible mission. 622 men volunteered for a mission with an uncertain return. Most knew they wouldn't come back, yet they went. Why? Because some things are greater than individual survival. Freedom, homeland, the man beside you. Newman's commandos fought for each other. Durrant took 27 bullets to protect his comrades. Chant lit the fuses with his hands covered in blood. Dockerel descended dark stairs with 120 pounds of explosives. These stories show how far humans can go. In the darkest moments, the brightest heroism is born. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: heroism isn't just about big names. We know the 5 men who received the Victoria Cross: Newman, Beatty, Ryder, Durrant, Savage. Their stories were written in books, made into films. But what about the others? Dockerel, Chant, Roy, Tirpitz, anonymous French farmers, sailors who burned in motor launches, wounded men who died on hospital ships. They were heroes too. They just didn't get medals. History usually remembers the big names, but real history rises on the shoulders of unsung heroes. Thank you for watching this video series. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which World War II story would you like me to tell? Let me know in the comments. And remember, history isn't just events that remain in the past. History is full of lessons that shape today and tomorrow. Those men at Saint-Nazaire, more than 80 years ago, on a dark night, changed the course of history. Perhaps one day you too will face your own Saint-Nazaire moment in your life, a seemingly impossible mission, a path with an uncertain return. At that moment, remember this story, and remember Newman's words: "Well, gentlemen, we've missed the boat. We'll have to walk home." Sometimes the only choice is to keep walking. See you in the next video. I'll continue telling the lesser-known stories of World War II. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.